Barack and Michelle Obama were ready for a peaceful first-class flight, but what happened next left them humiliated and furious. Discrimination, exclusion, and shocking words from the pilot. This was more than just a misunderstanding. Stay until the end to see how they fought back and sparked a global outcry. Make sure to subscribe and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. The steady hum of engines vibrated faintly through the walls of JFK International Airport as travelers hurried through the terminal, dragging their luggage behind them. Michelle Obama stood quietly near the large glass windows, watching the sun reflect off the polished tile floors. The noise of the airport seemed distant as she glanced at Barack standing beside her, hands casually resting in his pockets. His calm demeanor was comforting, but she noticed the faint crease between his brows, a telltale sign that his mind was working. They were on a rare trip with no public engagements or appearances planned, a brief escape to Los Angeles to unwind and enjoy time together. Yet, despite the promise of a peaceful trip, Michelle couldn't shake the unease that clung to her. "Ready?" Barack asked, catching her glance and offering a reassuring smile. She nodded, taking his hand as they approached the first-class check-in counter. The woman behind the counter greeted them with a mechanical smile that barely reached her eyes. Her sleek uniform and gold epaulettes indicated her senior position, but there was something in her gaze that immediately put Michelle on edge. "Good afternoon. May I see your passports and tickets, please?" the attendant asked, her tone polite but cold. Barack handed over their documents, his calm smile unwavering. Michelle watched closely as the woman's gaze lingered on their passports for longer than necessary. The woman flipped through the pages slowly, her fingers tapping the keyboard with an air of deliberate slowness. "These are for first class?" the attendant asked, her eyes flicking between the passports and the computer screen as if expecting to find a mistake. Barack's smile remained steady, but Michelle could sense the tension beneath his calm exterior. "Yes," Barack confirmed. "Is there a problem?" "Oh, no problem at all," the woman replied, though her expression suggested otherwise. She continued to type, her fingers moving with exaggerated care. Minutes dragged by as other passengers in the first-class line breezed through the process, receiving warm smiles and light-hearted banter from the staff. Michelle's unease deepened as she observed the stark difference in treatment. When the woman finally handed back their documents, her smile was tight and forced. "You're all set," she said, but her tone lacked sincerity. Michelle exchanged a glance with Barack, who gave her hand a gentle squeeze as they walked toward the security checkpoint. "That wasn't normal," Michelle muttered under her breath. "No, it wasn't," Barack agreed softly, "but let's keep going." The security checkpoint was no more welcoming. After removing their shoes, belts, and watches, they stepped into the body scanners. Michelle endured another prolonged inspection as a middle-aged TSA agent gestured for her to step aside. "Random check," the agent said, though his tone made it feel anything but random. Michelle raised her arms as he ran a metal detector along her body, patting down the seams of her dress. She kept her expression neutral, but her mind raced. The pattern was familiar. Random checks, prolonged stares, pointed questions. She'd experienced it too many times before. When they finally reached the gate, Michelle's nerves were frayed. She tried to focus on Barack's steady presence beside her, his ability to deflect tension with humor and charm. But even he seemed more guarded than usual, his gaze flickering toward the other passengers as they waited to board. A group of businessmen in tailored suits sat nearby, laughing over drinks. One of them, a silver-haired man with a Rolex that caught the light, kept glancing at Michelle and Barack. His expression wasn't overtly hostile, but there was a stiffness to his posture, a slight narrowing of his eyes that made Michelle's skin prickle. The boarding announcement came over the speakers, and the line began to form. As they approached the gate, Michelle felt her stomach knot. "First class boarding," the attendant announced, smiling warmly at the other passengers in line. But when Michelle and Barack stepped forward, the attendant's demeanor shifted. Her smile faltered, and she glanced down at their tickets with an air of disbelief. "These are for first class?" she asked, echoing the same question they'd heard at check-in. "Yes," Michelle replied, her voice calm but firm. For the first time, her tone carried an edge. The woman blinked, clearly surprised by Michelle's directness. Without further comment, she scanned their tickets and waved them through. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Michelle exhaled sharply, the tension in her chest refusing to ease. "I don't know if I can do this for 5 hours," she whispered. Barack rested a hand on her lower back, his touch grounding her. "We'll handle it," he said softly, "just like always." The cabin of the plane gleamed with polished wood and plush white leather seats. Soft lighting bathed the space in warmth, and flute glasses of champagne glinted on trays held by the flight attendants. It was designed to feel exclusive and luxurious, but as Michelle scanned the faces of the other passengers, she felt anything but welcome. A woman in pearls turned in her seat, her eyes lingering on Michelle just long enough for her to feel the judgment before the woman turned away. Michelle sat beside Barack, her shoulders stiff, torn between wanting to disappear into her seat and wanting to stand up and shout at every person who dared to look at her like she didn't belong. A blonde flight attendant approached, her smile practiced and professional. "Can I get you something to drink?" she asked. Michelle's voice remained steady. "Water, please." The attendant gave a clipped nod and disappeared down the aisle. Minutes passed. The flight attendant returned several times, refilling glasses of champagne for the other passengers. But Michelle's water never came. When Michelle finally flagged her down again, the woman's smile was tight. "Oh, sorry about that. I'll bring it right over." But she didn't. Michelle leaned back in her seat, her fists clenched in her lap. She glanced at Barack, her frustration simmering beneath the surface. "This is what you meant by handling it?" she asked quietly. Barack's eyes darkened, though his voice remained calm. "Not yet," he said, "but we will." As the engines roared to life and the plane lifted off the ground, Michelle stared out the window, her reflection caught against the fading skyline. She thought of her parents and the lessons they'd taught her about dignity and resilience. She thought of the countless times she'd faced prejudice, from college classrooms to boardrooms. But most of all, she thought of the fight ahead. This wasn't just a misunderstanding. It wasn't an accident. It was a pattern, a familiar, ugly pattern. And Michelle knew that before the flight was over, that pattern would be broken. She glanced at Barack, who was already reaching for his phone, setting it to record. The cabin had settled into a soft murmur as the plane leveled out at cruising altitude. Michelle sat stiffly in her seat, staring out the window at the clouds below. The tension in her chest hadn't eased since takeoff. She caught glimpses of the other passengers through the corner of her eye. Small, seemingly innocuous glances that lingered just long enough to send a clear message. She knew these looks too well. They weren't loud or overtly hostile, but they carried the same weight. A quiet message of exclusion, of disbelief that she and Barack were there at all. A blonde flight attendant appeared again, gliding down the aisle with a tray of drinks. Her demeanor was completely different when she stopped to speak with the couple in front of them. Her voice was warm and friendly, full of light-hearted laughter as she offered champagne and hors d'oeuvres. Michelle's stomach tightened as she watched the interaction, the difference in treatment undeniable. When the flight attendant finally turned toward their row, her smile faded into something more neutral, more forced. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice flat. Michelle opened her mouth, but Barack spoke first. "My wife asked for water earlier. It hasn't arrived." The flight attendant blinked as if the request had completely slipped her mind. "Oh, right," she said quickly. "I'll bring it over." Michelle watched her retreat down the aisle again, the tension in her shoulders refusing to ease. Minutes passed. The water didn't come. Barack sat with his phone in his hand, scrolling through messages and emails, his face a mask of calm. But Michelle could see the subtle signs of his frustration, the way his fingers tapped lightly against the phone's screen, the slight crease in his brow. He was waiting, observing, letting the situation unfold as he always did. But Michelle wasn't sure how much longer she could hold back her own anger. "I hate this," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the engines. "Why does it always have to be like this?" Barack glanced at her, his eyes softening. "I know," he said quietly, "but don't let them see it get to you." Michelle clenched her fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. She tried to focus on his words, tried to let his calm demeanor steady her. But the weight of the past few hours pressed heavily on her chest. She couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, judged, from every corner of the cabin. The flight attendant finally returned, carrying the long-overdue glass of water. Her smile was tight as she placed it on Michelle's tray table. "Sorry for the delay," she said curtly. Michelle took the glass without a word, her hand steady even as her mind raced with frustration. The flight attendant didn't linger. She moved on quickly, returning to the front of the cabin where the other passengers were laughing and chatting comfortably. Michelle took a sip of the water, her eyes flickering toward the group of businessmen sitting a few rows ahead. One of them, a silver-haired man with a Rolex watch, glanced over his shoulder at her and Barack. His gaze lingered just long enough for Michelle to catch the faint curl of his lip, a subtle sneer before he turned back to his companions. Her pulse quickened. She wanted to confront him, to ask what he found so amusing, so offensive about her presence in first class. But she knew how it would look. She knew how quickly any sign of frustration or anger from her could be twisted and used against her. Instead, she sat back in her seat, her shoulders stiff. Barack reached over, resting a hand on hers. "Not here," he murmured. "Not now." Michelle nodded, her jaw clenched. She understood what he meant. They couldn't afford to lose their composure, not in a setting like this. They couldn't give anyone an excuse to dismiss their experiences, to paint them as overreacting or too sensitive. But that didn't make it any easier to swallow the indignities piling up around them. The plane hit a pocket of turbulence, jolting slightly. The flight attendant let out a soft, nervous laugh as she steadied herself near the front of the cabin. "Oops," she said to the couple she was serving. "Looks like it's going to be a bumpy landing." Michelle's grip on her armrest tightened. She glanced at Barack, who was still scrolling through his phone, the camera discreetly angled upward to capture the interactions around them. "She's making it too easy," he murmured. Michelle let out a soft snort, the absurdity of the situation almost laughable if it weren't so infuriating. The blatant favoritism, the thinly veiled hostility. It was all too familiar, a pattern they'd seen time and time again. The flight attendant reappeared a few minutes later, this time carrying a tray of coffee cups. Michelle watched as she moved down the aisle, handing out drinks to the other passengers with practiced grace. But when she reached their row, her demeanor shifted again. "Would you like some coffee?" she asked, her voice devoid of the warmth she'd shown to the others. "No, thank you," Michelle replied, her tone polite but firm. The flight attendant hesitated for a moment before moving on, but as she leaned over to serve the couple behind them, her hand suddenly jerked. One of the coffee cups tipped forward, spilling its contents across the seat and onto Michelle's lap. Hot liquid soaked through Michelle's dress, scalding her skin. She gasped, jerking backward in her seat as the flight attendant let out a shocked cry. "Oh, I'm so sorry," the woman exclaimed, her eyes wide with feigned concern. "I didn't mean to." Michelle stood quickly, dabbing at her dress with a napkin, her heart pounding in her chest. The fabric of her outfit was ruined, the stain spreading rapidly across the light-colored material. Barack rose beside her, his expression calm, but his eyes dark with restrained anger. "It's fine," he said, his voice steady. "We'll handle it." The flight attendant continued to apologize, her words hurried and insincere. "It was an accident, I swear. I didn't mean to spill it." Michelle met her gaze, searching for any sign of genuine remorse. But all she saw was discomfort, the kind that came from being caught in an act that couldn't be easily explained away. "It's fine," Barack repeated, guiding Michelle back into her seat. "Let's just get through this." Michelle sat stiffly, her hands clenched in her lap. The coffee had cooled, but the heat of her anger remained. She glanced at Barack, who was already reaching for his phone again. "We're not letting this go," she whispered. Barack nodded, his expression serious. "We won't." As the plane continued its journey, Michelle stared out the window, her reflection faint against the clouds. She thought of her parents, of the lessons they'd taught her about dignity and resilience. She thought of the countless times she'd faced prejudice and discrimination, from college classrooms to corporate boardrooms. And she thought of the fight ahead. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the plane continued its journey through the sky, the hum of the engines a steady background noise. Michelle sat stiffly in her seat, her hands clenched tightly in her lap. The coffee stain on her dress had dried, leaving a dark, ugly mark that spread across the fabric. She could still feel the burn on her skin, but the physical discomfort was nothing compared to the simmering rage she felt inside. She glanced at Barack, who was typing something on his phone, his expression focused and calm. His ability to remain composed in situations like this never ceased to amaze her, but even she could see the tension in his jaw and the way his fingers tapped harder than usual against the screen. Michelle tried to focus on the passing time, counting the minutes until they would land in Los Angeles. But every moment felt like an eternity. Around them, the other passengers in first class continued to chat and laugh, seemingly unaware, or perhaps deliberately ignoring, the tension simmering in the air. The blonde flight attendant who had spilled coffee on Michelle was nowhere to be seen, and for that, Michelle was grateful. She didn't trust herself to stay calm if she saw the woman's face again. A soft chime echoed through the cabin as another flight attendant, this one a tall man with neatly combed hair and a crisp uniform, stepped into the aisle. His gaze swept over the passengers before settling on Michelle and Barack. There was a flicker of recognition in his eyes, and for a brief moment, Michelle thought he might treat them with the respect they deserved. But then, his expression hardened, and he turned away without a word, moving toward the front of the cabin to address the other passengers. "Ladies and gentlemen," the flight attendant announced, his voice smooth and practiced, "we will soon begin our meal service. Please let us know if you have any dietary restrictions or special requests." Michelle's stomach tightened as she watched the flight attendants begin to move through the cabin, handing out menus and taking drink orders. She and Barack hadn't been offered a menu or asked if they had any requests. She waited, hoping someone would eventually approach them, but as the minutes passed, it became clear they were being deliberately ignored. The first course was served: small, elegant plates of salad and artisan bread, followed by glasses of sparkling wine. The scent of freshly baked bread filled the cabin, making Michelle's mouth water despite her frustration. She glanced at Barack, who had stopped typing and was now watching the flight attendants with a quiet intensity. "They're not going to serve us," Michelle murmured, her voice low. "I know," Barack replied calmly. "Let's keep watching." The flight attendants moved efficiently, refilling glasses and engaging in light conversation with the other passengers. Michelle noted the stark contrast in their behavior toward everyone else compared to how they had been treated. One flight attendant leaned over to offer a second helping of wine to a woman in pearls, laughing softly at something the woman said. Another placed a small basket of warm rolls on the table in front of the businessmen a few rows ahead. But no one approached Michelle and Barack. The silence stretched on, the quiet exclusion more cutting than any words could have been. Michelle shifted uncomfortably in her seat, the anger bubbling beneath her calm exterior. She was used to facing prejudice, but there was something particularly infuriating about being ignored so blatantly, as if her presence didn't matter. A few rows ahead, she heard one of the businessmen speaking loudly, his voice carrying through the cabin. "It's nice to have a quiet flight for once," he said. "No drama, no nonsense, just normal people enjoying the ride." Michelle's grip on the armrest tightened. She didn't need to hear the rest of the conversation to know exactly what he meant. Her mind replayed the events of the day, the suspicious glances at the check-in counter, the prolonged security check, the condescending tone of the flight attendants. It was all part of the same pattern, a pattern she had seen too many times before. Barack reached over, resting a hand on hers. His touch was gentle, grounding her in the present moment. "We've seen enough," he said softly. Michelle nodded, her jaw clenched. "I'm done being polite." Barack gave her a faint smile. "So am I." The meal service continued without interruption. Michelle watched as the flight attendants brought out the main course, plates of seared steak and grilled vegetables, accompanied by more wine and champagne. The other passengers dined comfortably, unaware or unconcerned about the tension brewing in the back of the cabin. Finally, unable to stay silent any longer, Michelle pressed the call button above her seat. It took several minutes for anyone to respond. When the blonde flight attendant finally appeared, her expression was guarded. "Is there something I can help you with?" she asked, her tone clipped. "Yes," Michelle said, her voice steady. "We haven't been served." The flight attendant blinked, feigning surprise. "Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you didn't want anything." Michelle raised an eyebrow. "Why would you think that? No one asked." The woman's smile was tight. "I'll get something for you right away." She disappeared down the aisle, but Michelle had no illusions about her sincerity. She leaned back in her seat, her hands still clenched in her lap. The damage had been done. The exclusion, the judgment, it was all painfully clear. Minutes later, the flight attendant returned with 2 plates of food. She placed them on the tray tables without a word and quickly walked away. Michelle glanced down at the meal. Overcooked chicken and soggy vegetables, a far cry from the elegant dishes served to the other passengers. Barack sighed softly. At least they brought something. Michelle shook her head. This isn't about the food. I know. They ate in silence, the tension between them palpable. Michelle could feel the weight of the stares from other passengers, could hear the soft murmurs of conversation that seemed to pick up every time she glanced around the cabin. When the meal was over, the flight attendants moved through the cabin again, collecting trays and offering dessert options. Michelle watched as the businessmen were offered a choice of pastries and fruit, their plates carefully arranged on silver trays, but no one stopped at their row. As the plane hit another pocket of turbulence, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. There was a pause, then the captain's voice returned, softer and more conversational. I want to thank our valued first-class passengers for flying with us today. We appreciate your business and look forward to welcoming you back soon. The words hung in the air, a subtle reminder of the exclusivity of the space they occupied. Michelle couldn't help but notice that the captain hadn't acknowledged them directly, hadn't even glanced in their direction when they boarded. As the flight attendants continued their rounds, Michelle leaned toward Barack. What's the plan? Barack met her gaze, his expression calm but resolute. We keep watching. We let them show their hand. Michelle sighed, the frustration simmering beneath her composure. She hated waiting, hated the feeling of being powerless, but she trusted Barack's instincts, knew that he always played the long game. The flight attendants made one final round through the cabin, offering coffee and tea to the other passengers. When they reached Michelle and Barack's row, the blonde flight attendant hesitated for a moment before speaking. Would you like some coffee? She asked, her tone flat. No, Michelle said firmly. The woman nodded and moved on, her posture stiff. Michelle watched her retreat, her mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The tension in the cabin hung heavy in the air as the plane continued its journey toward Los Angeles. Michelle shifted in her seat, her frustration bubbling just beneath the surface. Her thoughts replayed the events of the flight, the cold stares, the dismissive attitudes, the deliberate exclusion from the meal service. It wasn't just an isolated incident. It was a pattern, a familiar one that she and Barack had seen too many times before. But this time it felt more personal, more pointed. She glanced at Barack, who sat beside her, still holding his phone discreetly in his hand. His calm demeanor hadn't wavered, but Michelle knew him well enough to recognize the subtle signs of his irritation. His eyes flicked toward the aisle, watching the flight attendants as they moved through the cabin with practiced ease, serving the other passengers with warm smiles and friendly conversation. A soft laugh from the front of the cabin caught Michelle's attention. She looked up to see a group of businessmen seated a few rows ahead, their conversation lively and animated. One of them, the silver-haired man with the Rolex, leaned back in his seat, swirling a glass of wine in his hand. His gaze drifted toward Michelle and Barack, lingering just long enough for her to notice. His expression was carefully neutral, but there was something in his eyes, a hint of superiority, of dismissal, that made Michelle's skin prickle. He's been watching us since we boarded, Michelle murmured, her voice low. I know, Barack replied without looking up. Let him. The plane hit a small patch of turbulence, causing the cabin to jolt slightly. Michelle gripped the armrest, steadying herself as the captain's voice crackled over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, we're experiencing some minor turbulence. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. The captain's tone was smooth and professional, but there was an underlying edge to his words. Michelle couldn't shake the feeling that the message was meant for them, a subtle reminder that they were being watched, that they didn't quite belong. The flight attendant appeared again, carrying a tray of drinks. She stopped at the row in front of them, offering refills to the couple seated there. Her voice was warm, her smile genuine as she engaged them in light conversation. Michelle watched, her frustration growing with each passing second. When the flight attendant finally turned toward their row, her demeanor shifted. The warmth disappeared, replaced by a more formal, distant tone. "Can I get you anything?" she asked, her voice flat. Michelle exchanged a glance with Barack before answering. "No, thank you." The flight attendant nodded curtly and moved on, her steps quick and purposeful. Michelle leaned back in her seat, letting out a slow breath. Her heart was pounding in her chest, a mix of anger and exhaustion weighing heavily on her. "This is what you meant by letting them show their hand?" she asked quietly. Barack nodded, his eyes still fixed on his phone. "Exactly." Michelle wanted to argue, to tell him that waiting and watching wasn't enough, but she knew better. Barack had always been patient, always played the long game. He understood the importance of gathering evidence, of letting prejudice reveal itself without provocation. Still, it didn't make the waiting any easier. As the plane continued its descent toward Los Angeles, the tension in the cabin seemed to thicken. Michelle could feel the weight of the stares from the other passengers, could hear the soft whispers that followed every interaction. She caught snippets of conversation, words that made her pulse quicken. "Do you think they're really flying first class?" one woman asked in a hushed tone. "I doubt it," another replied. "They probably use some kind of voucher." Michelle clenched her fists in her lap, her nails digging into her palms. The assumptions, the judgment, it was all too familiar. She glanced at Barack, who remained composed, his attention focused on his phone. "They think we don't belong here," Michelle said softly. "They always do," Barack replied, "but that doesn't mean they're right." The flight attendant returned once more, this time carrying a tray of desserts. She stopped at each row, offering a selection of pastries and fruit to the other passengers. When she reached Michelle and Barack's row, she hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Would you like dessert?" she asked, her tone clipped. "No," Michelle replied firmly. The flight attendant nodded and moved on, her posture stiff. Michelle watched her retreat, her mind racing with thoughts of what would come next. She couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over, that there was more to come. As the plane began its final descent, the captain's voice crackled over the intercom once again. "Ladies and gentlemen, we will be landing in Los Angeles shortly. On behalf of the crew, we'd like to thank you for choosing our airline. We hope you enjoyed your flight." Michelle let out a bitter laugh, shaking her head. "Enjoyed the flight," she muttered. "Right." Barack glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "We're almost there." Michelle nodded, but the tension in her chest refused to ease. She thought about the confrontation ahead, about the questions they would ask and the answers they would demand. She wasn't sure what would happen next, but she knew one thing for certain. This wasn't over. The wheels of the plane screeched against the runway as the aircraft touched down at Los Angeles International Airport, jolting slightly as it slowed to a steady roll. Michelle felt the tension in her chest tighten even more. She glanced at Barack, who was already gathering his things, his movements calm and deliberate. His phone remained in his hand, ready to capture whatever came next. The cabin was filled with the low hum of conversations as passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts and reaching for their bags in the overhead compartments. Despite the usual chaos of disembarking, Michelle could feel eyes on them. The stares weren't as overt now, but they were still there, lingering, curious, judgmental. The blonde flight attendant appeared near the front of the cabin, her polished smile still firmly in place. She stood by the exit, thanking passengers as they left. Michelle could see the stiffness in the woman's posture, the way her gaze occasionally flicked toward them and then quickly away. Michelle exhaled slowly, trying to steady her nerves. She couldn't let the frustration show, not yet. As they stepped into the aisle, the whispers started again. Michelle caught snippets of conversations, each word sharpening the edge of her anger. Did you see how she acted? Entitled. Looking for trouble. Michelle clenched her jaw, her fists tightening at her sides. She was done listening to the quiet judgments, done being treated like she didn't belong. Barack placed a hand gently on her lower back, guiding her forward with a calm, steady presence. "Keep walking," he murmured softly. They moved down the aisle toward the exit, each step feeling heavier than the last. When they reached the blonde flight attendant, her smile faltered for a brief second before she forced it back into place. "Thank you for flying with us," the woman said, her voice smooth but devoid of any real warmth. Michelle met her gaze head-on, refusing to look away. "Thank you," she replied, her tone firm and unwavering. The woman blinked, clearly caught off guard by Michelle's directness. For a moment, it seemed like she might say something more, but instead she stepped aside and let them pass. As they walked through the jet bridge, Michelle's heart pounded in her chest. The flight might be over, but the fight was just beginning. They emerged into the bustling terminal, where the noise of the airport washed over them in a chaotic symphony of announcements, conversations, and the steady hum of travelers dragging their luggage across the polished floors. Michelle let out a slow breath, relieved to finally be off the plane, but her relief was short-lived. Two uniformed security officers stood a few steps ahead, waiting near the exit. Their eyes locked onto Michelle and Barack the moment they stepped into view. Michelle's stomach dropped. She knew what was coming before the officers even spoke. "Mr. and Mrs. Obama," one of the officers called out, his tone polite but firm. "Yes," Barack replied calmly, stepping forward. "We need you to come with us for an additional screening," the officer said, gesturing toward a side corridor. His words were framed as a request, but there was no mistaking the underlying command. "Is there a problem?" Barack asked, his voice steady. "It's just a routine security measure," the officer said, though the words rang hollow. Michelle could see the tension in his posture, the way his gaze flicked between them, searching for any sign of resistance. Michelle opened her mouth to argue, but Barack gently touched her arm. "Let's go," he said quietly. They followed the officers through the terminal, the noise of the crowd fading into the background as they moved into a quieter, more isolated area. Michelle's skin prickled with humiliation as they passed curious onlookers. She could hear the murmurs and whispers trailing behind them. "Are they in trouble?" "Looks like it. They always play the victim." Michelle swallowed hard, forcing herself to keep walking. The secondary screening area was small and sterile, with white walls and bright fluorescent lights that buzzed faintly overhead. Two more security agents, a man and a woman, stood behind a counter, their expressions neutral but watchful. "Place your bags on the table," the male agent instructed, gesturing toward the metal counter. Michelle hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward and set her carry-on bag down. Barack did the same, his movements slow and deliberate. The agents began to unzip their bags, rifling through the contents with methodical precision. Clothes, toiletries, and a few personal items were pulled out and examined carefully, as if the agents were expecting to find something incriminating. The female agent picked up a book from Michelle's bag, flipping through the pages with unnecessary slowness. Michelle bit back a sharp remark, her patience wearing thin. "This is ridiculous," she muttered under her breath. The male agent glanced at her but didn't respond. He continued to inspect their belongings in silence, his expression carefully neutral. Barack stood close to her, his presence steadying her even as her anger simmered beneath the surface. Finally, after several long minutes, the agents stepped back from the counter. "You're clear," the male agent said, his tone almost begrudging. "Of course we are," Michelle snapped, unable to hold back her frustration any longer. Barack gave her a gentle nudge, signaling her to step back. "Let's go," he said quietly. They gathered their things, hastily repacking their bags before leaving the screening area. As they stepped back into the main terminal, Michelle let out a sharp breath, her chest tight with anger and humiliation. "This isn't random," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "They know it, and we know it." Barack nodded, his expression calm but serious. "We have what we need." Michelle glanced at his phone, the screen dark now but still in his hand. She knew he had been recording everything, the interactions with the flight attendants, the comments from the passengers, the security screening. It was all there, documented and ready to be shared. "We're not letting this go," she said firmly. "We won't," Barack agreed. They walked through the terminal in silence, the noise of the airport washing over them once again. Michelle could feel the weight of what lay ahead, the questions, the scrutiny, the backlash. But she also felt something else: determination. This wasn't just about a single flight. It was about something much bigger, something that needed to be addressed, exposed, and changed. As they reached the exit, the cool Los Angeles air hit them, a stark contrast to the stifling atmosphere of the plane and terminal. Michelle took a deep breath, letting the fresh air fill her lungs. The fight wasn't over. It was just beginning. Barack glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Ready?" Michelle met his gaze, her eyes filled with resolve. "Always." This story isn't just about one flight. It's about the fight for dignity and respect that many face every day. Barack and Michelle didn't stay silent, and neither should we. If this video moved you, share it with your friends and family to keep the conversation going. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a comment. Your voice matters, and it helps us bring more stories like this to light.